I was working on a cartel case, and it was a salon that was money laundering in upstate New York. And they were using the back of the salon to put the bricks of cocaine in the back. So they were bringing them in and bringing them back. So I was undercover. I actually went to the salon and I was getting my hair done. I tell this to people. What you remember when people point a gun to your head is you look at the barrel of the gun, you move up to the body, you move up to the hand, and you move up to meet the eyes of the person who has the gun on your head. And you will never forget what they look like, ever.
Welcome to another episode of Liberating Humanity. I'm your host, Paul Hutchinson. Today, I'm in Texas, in Houston, Texas, and I'm interviewing one of the most intriguing people that I have met in a long time. Her name is Angelica Robles. She was an undercover agent with the FBI. She was married to a cartel member, and we're going to talk in depth about her childhood, the traumas that she dealt with, working with people who have done horrific things, understanding their history, and understanding how we all can choose different paths based on how we react and how we heal from that trauma. So, Angelica, super excited to spend time with you today.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So, in a high level overview, I kind of touched on your stuff, but why don't you tell the audience, explain the A to Z history of where you came from, where you are now, and then we'll go into depth on some of it.
Yeah, so a little background on myself. I'm a former undercover agent, Forbes published, best-selling author, sold my story to Hollywood, became an executive producer, and I've just been through a lot of trauma, but within that trauma, I turned it into triumph. And I teach other women and other people that your childhood trauma does not define who you are, and you can take that and build amazing empires with that. So,
And that you've done.
yes, I have.
You're a woman of confidence, of achievement. I talk a lot about the statistics of how literally 2 out of every 3 people who have dealt with sexual abuse and significant childhood trauma, 2 out of every 3 become people like you. They're protectors. There's no way that somebody is going to hurt a child on your watch, right? You're powerful in your motivation. However, 1 out of every 3, if not given the help, the love they need, or by simply the decisions that they make, 1 out of every 3 end up becoming contact offenders.
Correct.
And so I want to discuss that separation and what brings somebody down that road, and what brings somebody down the road that you chose. And from a highlight perspective, we're going to go into the child stuff that you dealt with, but how did you end up working with the government as an interrogator, as a spy, et cetera?
So I grew up in Cicero, is a high crime, low economic, pretty much the Mexican hood in Chicago, and gang activity was crazy. So I went to a high school where we had the highest pregnancy rate in the country when I was in school. So having children was the norm. Having children was actually celebrated. We even had literally classes where you can just drop off your baby, and they made it into a child development class.
Wow.
And so 15 apparently was a magic age. Everybody would get pregnant. I did not get pregnant, thank God, because everybody around me was getting pregnant. But I went to a school where we had very high gang activity. There was a lot of gang activity. Obviously, there was a lot of drugs. There was a lot of sex. There was a lot of cartel activity. A lot of the kids came from immigrant parents. So a lot of these parents were working 24-hour shifts. So a lot of these kids were unsupervised and alone. So when I was young, I was dating my high school sweetheart. His sister was murdered, dismembered, and decapitated. It ended up being one of the worst Chicago crimes in history because of the way that she was murdered. And she actually, and I say this story so many times and it still gets me, because back then we didn't have the internet. Well, the internet wasn't there. And so she went on a date. She met a guy through a friend. They went on a blind date, they met up, and they were after him. So because she was with him, they had to take her out.
So this was gang activity that was after him for
Gang
money.
activity, cartel activity. If you read the entire transcript, I think they said the guy who killed them got paid $2,000 and the guy owed like $1,500. It's insane. And the way that he killed them was just sadistic and demonic. I mean, he shot them, he cut them up with samurai swords, you know, I guess they very satanic stuff. And then he flipped them upside down and drained their blood. And in the script, it's, I read it. It took me probably about 15 years to actually read through the entire process because I just couldn't. Emotionally and physically, I just couldn't read it until I was older. But if you read through it, it's insane. And he tried to say that he was unfit to stand trial. The voices in my head were talking, but it was premeditated, it was planned, it was executed, and obviously was involved with Cartel as well, which is crazy because of the way that my life kind of ended up going to Cartel almost. But because of that pain that I went through, I fell under a very deep depression. And I come from a Mexican background where we don't talk about our problems. And going to therapy or thinking about going to therapy means you're crazy. And so I remember getting so sad and I just couldn't get out of bed. I was having nightmares. I couldn't even go to her funeral because the family decided to just put whatever body parts they found of her into a coffin.
So sad.
And so even that was just very difficult to process. And I was 15. So for a 15-year-old to process that is very difficult. But I did spend 5 years living in Mexico. When I was born, my parents decided to bring all three of us, I'm the youngest of three, back to Mexico. And so I was raised for 5 years in Guadalajara. So I went to school there. And really the trauma started there because I was sexually molested by a neighbor. And I remember I was 3 years old and I remember it vividly. So for those people that think that kids don't remember certain memories, they say that you remember from 3 and up. And I remember it vividly. I remember what I was wearing. I remember him whispering in my ear. I remember all of this. And I remember him saying, if you tell anybody, I'm going to kill your family. Later on, I ended up finding out that he had also done it to other kids in the neighborhood and possibly his own sister because it was my friend's brother. But I remember thinking that what did save me from taking my life was going into therapy. It was actually my Spanish teacher that saw me falling asleep in class, losing weight, not paying attention. She pulled me out and said, there's something wrong with you. It's called depression. You probably don't understand it. Your parents probably don't understand it, but you need help.
That's so good that
Yeah.
she recognized that.
Yeah.
I point out a lot of these behaviors in my new book coming out, The Sound of Freedom. And I help parents and educators identify certain behaviors
Right.
in children that really need to be addressed. And, that teacher identifying the fact that you were losing weight, that there was something significantly wrong. Now, unfortunately, people didn't see the behavior changes in your little 3-year-old self that could have put that neighbor behind bars. But, sadly, 1 in every 4 women in the world, one in every 4 have been a victim of sexual abuse as a child. And we're
crazy.
carrying so much of that negativity. And the purpose of Liberating Humanity and everything that we're creating here with this podcast is to, yes, we go into the darkness. Yes, your story of what happened to your friend, that is dark, that is demon. But so is the rape of a 3-year-old. Some of our listeners are like, oh, I don't want to hear about the blood coming out, but yeah, abused as a 3-year-old, that's commonplace. No, that's just as demonic.
It's a reality that people don't want to see, don't want to hear or see or believe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it is the plague. It's the pandemic of our generation is that sexual abuse of a child.
Right.
And so, we talked a little bit before about how, and we'll go into deeper on this later, but, chances are that guy that did those horrible things to your friend probably dealt with similar things in his childhood as you.
Yes.
But I want to walk through your path of coming from that difficult childhood, you were raped by your neighbor, you had other things we'll talk about with your
Yeah.
family, et cetera, that you went through, but you made conscious choices throughout your life
Correct.
to be a positive impact in the world, to be a protector rather than to passing your pain on again
Right.
to somebody else.
Right.
So let's talk about your journey through that. So you're 3 years old, you were raped, you remember that vividly today. I'm sure that affected your self-esteem as a
Of
child.
course.
Here you are in school. Now the teacher recognizes this. So walk me through that process.
Yeah, so I actually was pulled out of school. That's how bad it was. I was doing an outpatient program for major depression because I couldn't deal with the fact that this horrific crime had happened. But then also, when you go through trauma, all your past traumas come up to the surface because our subconscious puts it away and we almost feel like we forget it. But then once you're triggered, it all comes back. And so I always say this, that therapy saved me because in that room, I remember my therapist saying, "Tell me everything that ails you. Tell me everything that hurts your soul, everything that you've been hiding away and that you want to get out." And I remember when I said it out loud, it was so liberating
Yeah.
because it was the first time that I had said it to anybody. I had never shared that with anybody but her. And so in that moment, obviously I started healing, but I told myself, I said, even though I had a lot of anger and a lot of pain, and that obviously the trial was going on, it it got me to this point where we as humans get so angry and we go into these dark spaces where I said, let me cut your head off. See how you like it.
Yeah.
And as sadistic as that sounds, that's how I felt. And so in that moment, I said, okay, well, let me go and get a degree in forensic psychology and figure out why these people do what they do. What makes them go to this extreme to murder people, cut their heads off and limbs off, and just have no remorse for it. And so after I graduated college, I went to the University of Champaign, U of I, and I got a forensic psychology degree. And then and this is how crazy life is. I don't know why my life is so crazy, but it is. So I graduated early, and you can't join the feds until you're 23 at the time. I think that's how it is still. So I was 21. So I had 2 years and I had 2 years to do something. So the first job I had was with CPS, the DCFS, which is Department of Family Services. Yeah. And it was the worst job ever. And my job was the person that took the kids out of the homes where they were being abused. So I would knock on your door in the middle of the night and take your kids with the sheriff. And I remember the caseload in Chicago was just insane, astronomical. There was not enough manpower to take on all these cases in Chicago. And it was rape, it was, physical abuse, mental abuse, burning kids. I mean, things that you can't even imagine that are happening in the US. Like you would think that stuff like this is happening in third world countries where they're like locking the kids up and not feeding them and starving them, or the kids are eating their own feces, all of that. And I only survived 6 months. That was it. I just couldn't physically do it.
I had a lot of my undercover operators that had seen blood, had seen, these guys were Navy SEALs, Green Berets, who one of them had led over 300 missions in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places. He had seen what he thought was the worst humanity had to offer.
Yeah.
He had seen, people that were shot and brains bleeding
Everywhere.
out, all this horrible
Right.
stuff, but going on just one undercover child rescue mission. We walked into this brothel that were selling children. And the second that the madam opened up a menu with pictures of these kids and lists of things that they were being sold for,
Yep.
it almost broke him. He almost blew the undercover there because you could see in his face that was the most horrific thing that he could ever imagine.
Right.
Even though he had seen all these other things. So yes, trigger warning time. This is some heavy stuff.
Right.
Hearing what happened to your friend, but then now you're in DCFS You're there. You're seeing what's happening to these children, these innocent children in these horrific positions, and this is happening in our own backyards.
Right.
This is right here in America, and it's happening. I tell people a lot. You could walk out in your front yard on your front porch. You can look left and you can look right. There's a high chance that one of those houses is a dangerous place for children.
Right.
And it's not just the slum neighborhoods. It's some of the nicer neighborhoods. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. And so much of it goes unreported, where people like yourself didn't have the chance to go in and pull these kids out of hell, and they bury this and they hold it for years. I mean, nobody in your family knew that you were raped at 3 years old when you were 3 years old.
Nobody knew.
Right?
Yeah.
You held that pain inside. In fact, the average age of somebody that talks about their abuse as a child, that even remembers it, the average age is 52 years old.
Yeah.
That's my age. You know, I've raised my kids. I have grandkids already. I've built my career. And if you're holding on to that trauma for all of those years, even if it doesn't, gratefully for me and so many other people that I love and work with, it doesn't ever come out in the abuse of others. But it'll come out in anger and low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, addiction,
Everything.
so many other negative things in
Absolutely.
our environment from holding on to that trauma. And so I'm super grateful for all of the people like you and my other operators who said, you know what, I'm going to turn my trauma into triumph. I'm going to do something about it. So you continued, you're with DCFS, you're there for 6 months.
I leave and I decide to go do criminal counseling with Cook County. So for those that don't know, so Cook County is where R. Kelly was indicted, and which is the major county in Chicago. And this is how life is really crazy. I feel like we are put in situations, some of us are put in specific situations for a greater cause. So one of the things that I share in the book is I got cancer when I was 21 in college. And I went through this process of, I have this disease, I may not make it, so I need to repent and I need to forgive. And so at that moment, I said, I need to forgive the killer of my friend. And I had to forgive him because the simple fact that I was carrying that anger around was making my life just miserable, because I was having nightmares. I was having physical problems with trying to deal with this, because when you don't deal with certain things, they just keep coming back. Sometimes we can push them away, but they just keep coming back whenever you're triggered.
And they show up physically, like
They
they did
show
with
up-
you.
they show
I
up
had a
physically.
company that helped people overcome anxiety and depression.
Yes.
We had 50,000 people a month calling in off of this infomercial to get help with them to overcome that. And I came to an understanding that I believe over 90% of the things that people go in to the doctor, physical problems in their
stress,
body, comes from that. You know, people are like, oh no, this is a physical thing, whatever. Here, let me tell you how powerful the mind is.
Yeah.
You know, if I had a bunch of teenage boys that were here and we brought in some beautiful women and they start taking their shirts off, their brains are going to release a chemical measurable in their bloodstream that's going to change how they feel and whatnot.
And how
right?
they act.
How they act, right?
Yeah.
And so, we see these things, even people that say, I've got anxiety, I have to have these drugs forever to, overcome because I have a chemical imbalance. No, that chemical imbalance is coming from negative habit patterns of thought, negative self-talk and worry and what if thinking and negative expectations, these loops. And so with what you are dealing with, there are so many people that through some of our holistic healing have been able to overcome things like cancer. That people are like, no, cancer is this and emotions are this. No, it's all intertwined. And so I want to go deeper on, so you were diagnosed with cancer at 21.
I was diagnosed with cancer at 21. I underwent the surgery to remove it. And I remember going through this process of, I need to release everything that has been just tying or really just taking away from my vitality. Literally, that's what it is. And so I did that and I said, I forgive him. I am releasing all of this pain, all of this anger, and I'm going to forgive you. And I'll tell you how this all happened. So when the trial ended, Judge Lampkin, which is the judge that did his trial and the whole indictment, sentenced him to death. So he was given the death penalty. Obviously, we cannot bring our loved ones back, but we felt some type of justice was being served. Like, guess what? You're going to get killed now. In 2006, the governor abolished the death penalty in the state of Illinois. So he still sits on death row. And I remember when that happened, I didn't feel good or bad or indifferent because I was already over the situation. I had forgiven him, but I said, wow, he now gets to sit and live out his life in prison, but he still gets to live. So after I left DCFS, I went to do criminal counseling, and my supervisor was Judge Lampkin. So it's crazy. I talk about this in the book, and I remember walking into her office and just looking at her, and she was like, "Did you see a ghost or something?" Because she had a really good attitude, and I loved her. She was almost like probably like my first mentor, and really the first woman that I looked up that was in a position of power in law enforcement. And I told her, I said, "Do you remember the Janet Mena case?" And she's like, "How can I not? That was one of the most
Horrific.
dreadful, horrific experiences of my life, to listen to what this man did to these two people." And I said, "That was my friend." And then, so I got to work with her, and she said, "Well, this is great. We get to work with all these people." So I was doing mental health assessments for um, criminals who had done horrific things that were unfit to stand trial due to insanity. So these were in jail, but in the mental health prison in Chicago. And there's a story in the book where I talk about, I was doing a mental health assessment on one of the murders, and I remember all these people in these facilities are highly medicated because they're considered to be, they're schizophrenic, delusional. They have a lot of symptoms. They're very symptomatic. And so they're kind of like zombies. I hate to say it like that, but they're over medicated to keep them calm. And I remember I was sitting and I was asking him how he was, did he eat, his dreams and stuff like that. Because our job as mental health assessments or criminal counselors were to try to get more information out of them from their childhood, to try to piece a story as to how they got to this part, which was why I went to forensic psychology in the first place. Well, this morning he was not feeling me because he lunged across the table and grabbed my neck and started strangling me. We both fell back, and I remember his breath in my face and the hotness of his breath, like grunting, like him trying to strangle me, to kill me. And I remember thinking, okay, this is it. But I remember they give you these little buttons, the
little emergency
the little emergency buttons, and obviously they came and they got him off, and I remember having the marks on his hands on me, and I remember that feeling of not being able to breathe. And you know what that brought me back to? When I was sexually molested.
Wow.
That feeling of like that pain of like not being able to breathe. And so I tell people, when you go through traumatic experiences, it triggers your traumas, and it triggers in your brain and in your physical being, going back to those moments. But he I'm sure he wanted to kill me because he's just a killer by nature, but also he probably didn't want to be there, and he's like, "Hey, I'm not tied down, might as well go for it. I'm here forever. Let me take one more out." That's how I saw it.
So how, walk me through, you had a unique opportunity to get into the depth of the lives of these people. I read a statistic where over 60-70% of incarcerated felons report having significant abuse as a child.
Yes.
Now,
mental health issues as well.
Again, for my audience, don't get me wrong here. This is not any sort of justification in any way for any of these actions. Everybody has to pay the consequences for their actions. You can, these guys, I tell people, don't get me wrong, I'm not a pedophile sympathizer. I've put my life in danger hundreds of times to ensure that they never hurt innocents again, ever. Right. However, in order for us to fix this problem, as a whole, whether it be child abuse or sex trafficking or murders or any of these things, in order to fix this problem, we have to understand the role of generational trauma. We have
Yes.
to understand the role of our childhood growing up. Now, granted, people like you had difficult childhoods and you turned into a protector, just like a lot of my
Right.
operators. But walk me through what you learned in the process of delving in to these people's lives as you were interrogating them
Yeah.
and talking to them.
So the biggest thing was sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, one parent household, obviously, and mostly poverty, always poverty. It's always something socioeconomically that was involved, one parent household, and then also the abuse. The abuse was number one. The abuse was number one with cartel members, with killers, murderers, terrorists as well. The only population that I saw that didn't have that much child abuse, but it's probably because it's not really reported, was terrorists. But terrorists were operating more based on faith than based on feelings,
Mm.
because it's a faith based. At
Mhm.
least the terrorists that I interrogated. But I remember in that moment, my boss thought she's never coming back. This guy almost tried to kill her. And in fact, I sympathized with him and I had compassion for him, that I was like, he must have been triggered by something I said, something I wore, something that day that made him want to kill me. And I understood him based on my triggers whenever things happened to me. So when I was 18, my grandfather tried to rape me. He was an older man, but I remember I was going through my depression and he saw me in a vulnerable state. And I remember him pushing me against the wall and trying to take my clothes off. And I was already 18 at this time. And I remember thinking, you're a frail man. And I pushed him away. And I remember him saying, nobody's going to believe you. And you're already 18. So I'm just going to say that you wanted it. And I was like, none of that would make any sense. But the crazy thing about this all is that I grew up in a family where probably a lot of the kids were probably molested and they lived in silence. And he got to a point where he felt that it was okay to now continue on to the grandchildren. Because when he died, I remember I have 31 cousins. I remember talking to all my girl cousins, and they all said the same thing. He was trying to show us porn. He was trying to show us how to please a man. And his justification was that he was very hard on his daughters, that they all ended up getting divorced because they obviously married as virgins and their marriages didn't work. So he felt that the next generation needed to learn how to please men because his daughters' marriages fell apart.
Wow.
It's insane. It's
Wow.
actual insanity. And I remember, and I talk about this in my book, he was sleeping with my friends in high school and paying them $500 to sleep with him. And I remember telling my friends, why are you doing this? And they said, because we need the money. My families need the money. And $500 is a lot of money. That's like 2 months of groceries or even more. And I remember thinking to myself, these kids come from so much trauma and so much loss and so much abandonment, that my one friend that was having sex with my grandfather felt that that he actually loved her, because her father was an alcoholic, mother left, so she was an abandoned child, displaced child. And so again, he was really having sex with this underage girl and making her feel like he loved her. He would buy her clothes and shoes, so she felt like this is the love that I have seen. I've never seen this type of love before.
And that's super common in
Yeah.
in the grooming.
In the grooming phases, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm here to help. I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to make you a better person. This was it. So in my mind, I thought, I'm not the only one. I'm definitely not the only one that this happened to. I just happen to be the one right now because I'm turning 18. And there was more cousins that were coming down, and in their family there was instances where the cousins would tell the parents, hey, he's showing us porn, and the parents would turn the cheek and say, no, no. They were delusional.
Wow.
They were delusional. But when he died, it was like the patriarchal cords or like hold were broken. and everybody snapped out of it and was like, oh my God, this was really going on.
I think that's one of the reasons why the average age of somebody talking about that is 52, is because, you know, if your abuser was likely 20, 25 years older than you, then that puts them in their late 70s. So statistically, about the time those people are starting to die off, all of a sudden now the fear that that little 3-year-old self was told, if you say anything to anybody, I'll kill you, whatever else. As soon as that's gone, then the subconscious mind says, okay, now I don't have the fear of that person retaliating. Now I'm able to release these memories and talk about it. But
for sure.
But the problem is, you know, if you're holding on to it, even if you don't remember, if it's subconscious, you're holding on to those deep-seated traumas, it's going to affect all areas of your life.
Definitely. And I think for me, statistics show it only takes one person to change your trajectory. You only need one person to believe in you or to aid you and help you and love you in a good way for you to be able to turn around. And for me, it was my therapist. And I remember when I went to college, my therapist said, you need a therapist in college because you need to continue your journey of healing. And so then I turned 23, got into the feds, did all that. And I love telling this story because when I was in training and I was in the academy, they put you through hell. They show you videos of people getting decapitated. They show you warfare. They show you this to mentally strengthen you. I looked around and people were throwing up. And I literally was like, I've been through this. I've seen this. I grew up in an environment where there was gunshots, there was people getting killed. This is nothing for me. And that's the difference, I think, is I was already predisposed to a lot of these things. And so as you go through trauma and you heal from it, you learn to deal with other traumas in a very eloquently and graceful way. And I say it that way because people were like, how do you deal with this? Now, I did go through the turmoil and the pain and all that. That's what got me into therapy. But I talk about being suicidal, and a lot of people don't talk about being suicidal and what that feels like and what that looks like, to take your life away because that's your better option than to
you're
living.
in so much pain, whatever that is, anxiety, depression, just, you know, to be to the point where you think that unknowing what the other side is, just I'm out. There's no better option than exiting stage left. And that's sad. It's sad what a huge high percentage of our population, even, you know, in the military, returning vets, we're losing like 20 a day throughout our nation to suicide because of the unresolved trauma, a lot of it from the PTSD and whatnot that they're going through. And so I've delved deep into identifying a lot of different tools that people can use. But you touched on one that I think is so important, is when you first sat down with your therapist and were able to simply verbalize and tell your story, but when you said it out loud, that a big part of that heaviness on your shoulders and your heart and your life was able to just start releasing by just talking about it, just saying it. You know, I tell, you know, so many guys are like, oh, you know, I don't want to talk about what happened to me when I was 8 because, you know, that thing was my uncle, because if I talk about it, it'll make me less of a man. No, it won't.
Makes me look weak.
Yeah. No, well, you were 8. You know, that was a horrible thing that happened from a horrible situation with somebody that was carrying that pain. Even if you just talk about it with your spouse, even if you go into a therapist, anybody, you know, going in and just saying, hey, you know what? Don't judge me. This isn't something that I'm passing on in any way. I just don't want to hold this pain anymore. The simple act of talking about it, you know, people think, oh, you know, they'll put me in this category where they don't want me to be around kids because this is what happened to me. No, it's exactly the opposite. By holding it in, you have a higher chance of that trauma coming out in negative behaviors.
Yeah.
By talking about it, by simply sharing it with somebody who can hold space for you in
Yeah.
that sharing
Absolutely.
opportunity, then the chances of you passing that on in the forms of anger, physical, verbal abuse, etc., go way down because you're releasing that trauma.
Right. Absolutely. And one of the biggest things is if it's unresolved, it just capitalizes and it grows as you grow. It doesn't, with time, it doesn't go away. The only way that things get resolved is by healing and you actually getting into those rooms and healing. And I think a lot of people say, well, it happened so long ago, you should just forget about it. These are things that you just can't forget. And so with my pain, I turned 23. And so now I was ready to go in, went and did all the training. And I remember saying, how do I become a profiler? A profiler is not really a position like the movies make it mean. It's just a high level interrogator. And they said, well, the fastest route to get there, because everybody wants to get there, is to do undercover work. Nobody wants to do undercover work because, as you put your life at risk and there's a potential of you losing your life. So the traumas then even got worse. So I talk about being taken. I was taken. I had 10 guns to my head at one point. And I've removed 10 guns. Yeah. And it was like rifles, really like, automatic weapons, ARs. And I remember I was doing undercover work and this was in upstate New York and it was all corporate fraud. So, and I say corporate fraud obviously is cartel because it's like white collar crime. Anything over $25,000 is considered corporate fraud. And I was doing undercover work. And I stress this because I'm in my 40s and we didn't have iPhones. We didn't have the technology we have now. I can sit at home and watch you do everything that you're doing nowadays, because I can hack into computers, I can hack into cameras, I can hack into all things now. Back then, that wasn't how it was. Back then, we were in the little van with the little VCR camera with a big tape in it. We were doing old school surveillance. And I tell people this because this new school surveillance is totally different. It's all digital. We can even hack into burner phones now. Phones that you get at the CVS, we can even hack into those. And it was hell. It was hell for a woman because we had to stay in these vans for over 12 hours. Now, and I say this in every single interview I do, for a man, you can pee in a cup and you're good. We can't do that. And so I say this to people and they think it's crazy, but this is how we're living. If you are undercover, you are in extraneous conditions. You are not like 007 with the Lambos and the Angelina Jolie with the hair and makeup going down the side of the building. You are in shit conditions for hours because you cannot keep an eye. You can't let your target go away. You're literally watching them all day, every day, audio, listening, all that. And people don't understand that surveillance now is done very differently because of the technology. We didn't have technology back then. And so
I'm intrigued with the guns to your head story.
So
how did that happen?
So I got my cover blown. And here's the thing. When you're doing surveillance in a rural area and somebody's following you, it's very hard for you to hide. There's only so many trees you can hide. And you can't really hide a car, especially if you're on pursuit of somebody else. So obviously they found me. The way that the actual story goes, to not tell too much because we're going to get into detail in the movie, but what I do share in the book is we started to play what we call cat and mouse game, where they found me, they started chasing me, and then we started literally chasing each other, trying to get away from each other. To make the story is I was working on a cartel case, and it was a salon that was money laundering in upstate New York, and they were using the back of the salon to put the bricks of cocaine in the back. So they were bringing them in and bringing them back. So I was undercover. I actually went to the salon and I was getting my hair done. And in my purse, I kid you not, this is the technology from back then. We had cut a hole in my purse and put a camera in the purse so that it would tape the activity that was going on in the back while I was getting my hair done. And it did catch it. You could see the people because we knew at what time the product was coming in, at what time the product was going out. And I remember that's how we did it. Like people laugh, but that we didn't have the technology that we have now. So anyway, I get in the car and I start leaving. And I think the lady that was doing my hair was like, hey, I don't think she was here for her hair.
Mm,
And so next thing you know, I
they're
was in
following you.
pursuit. They were following me. The pursuit happened in upstate New York is very mountainous. And I remember they crashed into the back of my car and they were trying to get me to fall off the cliff and die, just like the movies. That is true. And I remember my car like skidding and hitting the little rail thing.
Guardrail.
And I'm like, oh my God. And the car went like this, where you're like, you can fall to your death. And they left, but then they came back and they got me out the car and then they put me on the floor. And I remember, if you've ever had guns to your head, I tell this to people. What you remember when people point a gun to your head is you look at the barrel of the gun, you move up to the body, you move up to the hand, and you move up to meet the eyes of the person who has the gun on your head. And you will never forget what they look like, ever. And I remember seeing one African American woman amongst the 10 guns. And I said to myself, wow, maybe she'll spare me. And I think because of her, they probably did spare me. So they did take me. They did blindfold me. I didn't know where I was going. I had 2 phones at the time. I had my personal phone and my government issued phone. My personal phone, they threw it out and it was gone. Obviously wasn't working. My government phone, I stuck it in my bra. As soon as I knew they were coming back, I stuck it in my bra, which was probably how I survived. And I tell this to people because they don't understand. Now we can ping your phone directly. Back then, the only way that we found phones and their locations was if they drove by a tower. And back then it was called pinging. We still call it pinging, but it's different now. And I remember when I don't know where they took me, but I remember feeling the car moving. And when your eyes are covered, your other senses
heighten up.
literally
Yep.
heightened up.
Mhm.
So I literally remember the bumps in the road and like my body jerking back and forth. I remember that. And I remember hearing the hissing of the engine of whatever car they were driving because your senses heightened. And I remember they took me somewhere, what it looked like, it was like a warehouse, but it could have been like a slaughterhouse where they had like animals, and it was upstate New York, so it made sense. And I remember just getting beat and not seeing who was actually hitting me. So imagine
They
just
have something over your head.
yeah, they had like a bag over my head or blindfold. I don't know what it was, but I remember getting beat, getting hit. And so literally what I tell people is like, imagine somebody hitting you with a bag of bricks and you can't see when or where it's coming from. And all you feel is the blows and the sound of it's almost like your brain goes like bing, bing. It's weird. It's a weird way to explain it. And so all I remember, because I think at some point I went unconscious, I remember waking up and I was getting rescued. And I remember one of the guys saying to me, we found you because of your phone that pinged off the one tower that they passed by.
Wow.
And because it's a rural area, there's only so many buildings. So that's why when
they were able to identify that ping, know where you were after leaving.
Right. And this is why I
salon.
tell people, a lot of people don't believe certain stories. Like, let's talk about the Trump thing. How did you guys not, there was one building there and you didn't see the guy climbing the building? It's like, I was able to be, it's so precise. Even then it was so precise, but I think that they let me go. And I say this so many times, and I think this worked in my favor. So when I was doing undercover work, I was 23. And I did it from 23 to 26. I looked very young. I was hired because I looked very young. So I would follow people in the grocery store with pigtails and a hoodie and a backpack, and you would never know that I was following you. You would think it's just a kid looking at magazines. And I think that's why I was hired to do undercover work. And I think they felt like this is a child that we're beating up.
Wow.
And I think they let me go. They had a little bit of compassion. But then I also remembered when you are taken into custody or when you are taken as a prisoner, you lose your limbs. They disfigure you. They disfigure your face. They cut your limbs off. They cut your legs off. as a sign for you to never forget that you fuck with us, we're coming back for you, so that you can live in this turmoil and be in this like horrendous feeling of fear. And I remember thinking, man, I'm not deformed. I have all my limbs. I'm blessed. I'm very blessed. After that happened, I remember you go through therapy. You always go through therapy, whether you are taken and when you kill somebody. And I remember going through therapy again and being like, I'm back here. And we went through the process. But every time you go through trauma, it just gets a little bit easier because you have the skills to process it quicker because now you've learned how to process it. And so after that, I remember they're like, all right, you're done. Like you earned your stripes.
They thought you have enough trauma that you're gonna go bag groceries somewhere. You're not gonna continue fighting this fight.
Yes.
But that's not who you
So
are.
I did it for 2 years. That was the worst of it. The other times was just getting shot, the car, all that stuff, which I say that in a very, like, it's nothing because I grew up in a neighborhood where people were getting shot. So that wasn't scary. What was scary
Where did you get shot?
I mean, the car. No, not physically, but the car. I never physically got shot, thank God. But I remember feeling the frightening of like when you have guns to your head. And I remember being in therapy groups where there was a lot of African Americans that would talk about being pulled over and having guns to their head. And they said the same exact thing.
You see the barrel,
you see the barrel, you see the finger, you move up and you meet with the eyes. And one of the guys said, when you look at their eyes, you can tell whether you're gonna survive or when you're gonna die. And that is a very, very terrifying place to be. But I think that because of her, I think they spared me. And because I look so young, they spared me. So after that was done, I was rescued. Everything was fine. I was brought back and I said, I'm done. Like I was really done. And thank God I was done. And then at that point, so that was 2008, they transferred me down to Houston and they're like, all right, great. You're going to go do human trafficking. I didn't even know what human trafficking was. I had no idea that it even existed because I was doing all corporate fraud for so long. And I was like, what do you mean in Houston? And so that's how I ended up in Houston in 2008.
Houston is what? It's like the second.
The second. We actually were the first, but California beat us. So we're now the second. We're like second with Florida. Yeah.
In terms of the number of human trafficking
In terms of the
cases.
Numbers, but obviously there's a lot of numbers that don't get tallied up. Yeah. So I'm sure.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think Houston's so high?
Obviously because we're border town. Obviously, we're a border town to Mexico, and that kind of it's like a feeder state. We're a feeder state, just like Arizona, just like California.
And you've got a port here too.
And we have a port here, of course, the port of Houston, just like Florida and California.
That's why our Oregon is pretty high as well because of the port city it is.
Of course. And I feel when we start talking about human trafficking, people don't realize. So if I didn't know about it, I was literally picked to come work human trafficking in 2008. It's 2024 now. The technology has gotten better now, which is bringing more accessibility for the perpetrators to easily catch these kids. And so it's just getting worse. The numbers are getting worse. And during the pandemic and after the pandemic, it got worse because we were now in our homes doing nothing. The vices and the addictions of all these people just
through the roof.
10x'd. Yeah. And so everything 10x. Cartel activity, drugs, all that, including the human trafficking.
And we see it worse now than ever with the border open policy that we have. It's just these children are flooding in.
Right. And you said it was 140,000?
Yeah. Over like 130, 140,000 children a year. Are being brought in that are unaccompanied minors.
That's insane.
And they've lost a year ago they admitted 85,000 children. There's now another 291,000 children that don't have their court date set up, that they have no way of following up with where these kids are. Gratefully, there are a lot of good families who are supporting these children. I'm all about healthy immigration. You know, you're Hispanic descent. My wife is Hispanic descent.
Yeah.
you know, and if we didn't have, in fact, not even Hispanic. I mean, my great grandparents all came from other countries. Pretty much all of us are immigrants in some way.
Yeah.
And I am a huge supporter of healthy immigration, but when you have these policies in place that allow for these kids to be just trafficked by these perpetrators across the border without any proper follow-up, now we have some problems. And so,
Yeah.
no, you went
Yeah.
into human trafficking, and
I'm going to tell you something that is very scary that I don't think the public knows. So I went and tried to get into the work of how these kids are placed. And as an agent, I remember thinking these people are not qualified to do this type of work. But because the need is so high, I remember I went to a training and I just sat there and I remember the trainer saying, "You don't belong here. You're a Fed. You're from the other side." And I said, "I just want to learn what the process is." You know how many days they have to place a kid? 10.
wow.
They have 10 days to place a kid with either a parent, a relative, an aunt, an uncle, a neighbor. And they literally said, as long as they don't have a criminal background, we'll give these kids to whomever.
Wow.
And the kids that don't have anywhere to go end up in shelters where they end up running away anyway.
Yeah.
And I was like, 10 days? And they said, yes, you have 10 days from the processing, from the time the kids gets processed in, 10 days.
Wow.
Because there's just another slew of kids coming
There's
out.
hundreds of them a day that are coming across the border.
Yeah.
So
It's insane. I couldn't believe it. I was like, 10 days? I'm like, when I get a report, I get 28 days to submit that report.
Yeah.
And it's a report.
Yeah.
This is a child. This is a life that gets 10 days to say, okay, you're either going to go to Uncle, Pablo or whatever. And the crazy thing is none of these people are getting vetted. And most likely they go to these people and they become children of abuse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
They get trafficked
Right.
here in the US. So let's move forward with so you got married.
I got married.
You
I got
have
married
you
in
have two you got
2013.
two kids out of
I
your
have
marriage.
two beautiful babies.
And 10 years into your marriage. Now, realize you're an interrogator, you've worked with the FBI,
I've worked with
all
everybody.
this stuff,
Yeah.
and then 10 years later you get a little surprise. What is
Yes.
that?
So I left federal, like actually working for the federal government 2013. I took a 2-year sabbatical, got married, and I then came back and started my own company as a consultant government contractor. At the time, I had 6 contracts. So I was doing the same thing that I was doing as an agent, but now I was doing as a consultant basis. I had become such an expert in my field that I was getting picked by different agencies to come work specific high-risk cases. So pandemic hits and nobody knew what we were going to do. So our contracts kind of get halted. Like the entire government just shut down. And so they're like, nobody's traveling, nobody's doing any work. We got to see what we're doing with this thing. At the time, I get approached by Hastmark Publishing Company, international publishing company, because they had heard my story. And now that I wasn't a Fed anymore, they were like, now she can talk about it because she's a consultant. So I got approached to write the story of my life, undercover work, all that. So I said, okay, let me write it. I write the book. During that time, we had lost the contracts. So I ended up picking up a job at the DEA office here in Houston. I was supervising the wire room. And that was something that I wanted to do. I had never been on that side. I had always been on the field. I had never been on the side where you're actually listening to the calls. And I thought that was so cool because we can tap into all types of phones and WhatsApp and everything. Like, you're not safe with technology, by the way. And I was working at the DA office, which is even crazier. Anyway, my husband at the time, so 3 years ago, reads the book and gets triggered by my trauma. And I was starting to outgrow myself. And I say this because when I sat down and wrote my book, I wrote it in 3 weeks. And when you get all the trauma out of your system, you start to grow and to heal as a person. And I found me writing my book as a cathartic experience. I was relinquishing all this pain that I had still uh, felt, right? From like the traumatic stuff of undercover work and all the stuff I've been through, because it was like another slew of trauma. And so my husband at the time reads the book and he says, I need to tell you something. And I remember I was working night shift and I came home at 6 a.m. and I had my gun on me and I said, I'm tired. I could barely keep my eyes open because this weight. And he says, no. And then I said, okay. So he's like, you need to sit down. So he tells me, my family and I have been part of the Mexican cartel. I literally went like this. In a split second, I said, I'm going to kill him and I'm going to have the government cover it up. That was my plan. In that instant, that was my plan. Because
you had been lied to for 10 years.
10 years,
you had no
2
idea.
babies, no idea. And talking about a humbling moment, I was considered one of the best interrogators in the world. I had worked with every single agency. I had been to DC. I had been to the White House. I had worked at the Pentagon, everything. I had done it all, been, done the undercover, all that.
You didn't know you had to interrogate your husband.
And I was like, exactly. So then, and I tell this so many times, in that split second, I told myself, you can either kill him and have the government cover it up, or you can do what you do best and interrogate him. I let go of my gun and I literally said 2 words. I said, tell me more. For the next 2 hours, he tells me.
3 words. But...
Yeah. Yes, 3 words. He tells me everything. And he just tells me he grew up in the cartel. His father was moving drugs as a child. His uncle was murdered, decapitated, and dismembered by the cartel because he was moving $1 million worth of cocaine up north. And then all the red flags in the last 10 years came up. The house with the secret compartments, the 2 uncles that were murdered. Why was there so much murder in this family? Why were there so many secrets? The divorce, there was land involved, all types of stuff. And I said to him, I said, I have to report this. And he says, yeah, I know. And so it took me 3 weeks to report it because I had to process it. I was like, what did I get myself into? Are we safe? Are my children safe? What kind of involvement are you in? I didn't know. But what I did know was that, because I got dragged on Instagram and social media because people are like, how do you not know? This is one thing I want to stress to people, and this. Cartel members are not just moving drugs. Not all cartel members or cartel activity is actual moving drugs. It is literally an enterprise.
It's organized crime.
It's organized crime.
Yeah, they're buying buildings in Houston.
They're buying buildings. You have doctors, you have lawyers, you have pediatricians, you have accountants, you have builders, you have roofers that work for the cartel. And a lot of people are like, there wasn't drugs under the house. There wasn't money in the walls. That was not the type of work that he was doing. He was doing the business side of it. But the bigger thing that I always stress is I didn't do the background check on him. The government did. The government cleared him when we got engaged, which was like 13 years ago. And so who dropped the ball here, right? And so they cleared him. But what I tell people is that even when the government does background checks, they don't call in a forensic accountant to look at accounts. That's the only way that you find out what money's coming in and out and what shady business is going on with actual money or money being washed. Like, people don't understand those things. So, yeah.
That's fascinating.
It's crazy. And then 3 weeks later, so this happens. We're having my son's 3rd birthday. We got to put on the happy face and the happy dance and have the luxurious birthday parties that we had at a farm with the animals. And I remember my attorney was at the party. And I pulled her to the side, and she remembers this. She's a judge now. And I pulled her to the side and I told her, I said, he is part of the cartel. And I remember her telling me, you need to get $50,000 out in cash right now. I remember her telling me, and I told her, I don't have access to any of the money. And she was like, what do you mean? And that was the first incident, is I let him control the money because I trusted him. He was my husband. That was something that he was doing, was the finances. I never saw his money coming in. He saw my money coming in, but I never thought to see his money coming in or what money he was making. So I remember when I reported it, it seemed my boss was silent for what seemed like an hour. She didn't know what to do with the information. She was almost like, how did this happen? And I'm like, you're telling me, I don't know. And I remember her saying, I have to go up to her boss, and then her boss had to call the Pentagon. And then the Pentagon got involved. And so I ended up going under a 7-week federal investigation to make sure I was not involved, because I gave the oath to the government. They didn't care what he did, because as far as that was concerned, it's hearsay. He said one thing, but there's no evidence backing it up. I had no evidence. What evidence did I have?
Mhm.
And so I went under federal investigation for 7 weeks. I get flown to the Pentagon. I'm now sitting on the other side of the interrogation table getting interrogated.
The
Yeah.
interrogator getting interrogated.
Yeah. And I remember sitting there
You
like,
passed, obviously.
right. Right. And I remember thinking, like, you're really going to ask me that? Like, I just trained you. And when it was all said and done, they said, you weren't involved. You know, after phones, accounts, everything got tapped. You weren't involved. There was a conversation where I called my best friend and I was screaming, crying in the fetal position, my life is over. And they had that recorded, me saying, how did I not see this? And I remember, till this day, she remembers. And I remember they said, you have 2 choices. You either divorce him and disassociate yourself from the family, or you're blacklisted. Pick one. So I wanted to tell people, this is a 24-year career that was going down the drain.
Hmm.
Now, I decided to publish the book with the extra 2 chapters because the book was already finished. So I added 2 more chapters discussing everything that had happened. And the book ends with me saying, I don't know if I'm going to get canned or not. I did get canned, and it was because I published the book. Obviously, they didn't say that, but I got suspended November. I published November 21. I was suspended December. I was terminated January of 22.
Hmm.
But what I want to tell people and women that are going to trauma is that I lost my career, my 24-year career. The book became a bestseller, and I ended up selling the book to Hollywood. And then I got put on one of the biggest stages with Natasha Graciano and became a motivational speaker. So I literally took my trauma and turned it into an entire empire. And I still do consulting for the government on different levels, but I lost my entire career because of the man that I chose to marry.
Wow.
And I take accountability for who I was in the marriage, that I never gave him the space to be able to tell me this big secret. But I'm like, you could have married any other woman in this earth, and you decide to marry the Fed, which is crazy.
Him and his family knew it. Maybe they were keeping tabs on you.
His family knew it. His obviously he comes from a millionaire family. The dad gave us 0 cents for the wedding. We had this lavish, really, like, thinking about it, cartel style wedding. I mean, we rented a villa, had 100 rooms. Everybody stayed the night. We fed them breakfast. You know, literally the lavish, over the top wedding. And, you know, the dad was there, the mom was there. And I remember he said, don't marry her. She's going to fuck us up. I remember. And I actually remember trying to call the wedding off. My best friend actually got a role in the movie, because in the book I say how I wanted to stop the wedding. My gut instinct, I was having like convulsions before I went down the aisle. And she's like, it's just cold feet. And she convinced me to go on with the wedding.
Well, you got 2 good kids out of it.
Yes, that's what I say. But here's the thing that I want people to really understand is, if you don't go through trauma and pain, you don't know what it is to be on the other side. You can't get over anything without going through it. And for me, it's spun off an entire new career, as I get to come on podcasts, I get to tell my story, and I get to motivate people that your trauma does not define you.
Define you.
Yes.
Yeah, that's probably the most powerful thing I want people to take away from this conversation.
Yeah.
Are those words. Your trauma does not define you.
Right.
Yeah, the past is the past, and we can all move forward. You've been through horrible things starting when you were 3 years old, and then continuing with all of the things that you saw when you guys were being raised in Mexico for those years, and then, you know, in high school with your friend being killed in a most horrific way. But all of that trauma led you to a place where you're like, no, I want to use this to motivate myself to protect people. How can I use my talents to protect people? And so you go through the academy, you get trained, you got to start working with the government, an interrogator, and then undercover stuff that you've done, simply fighting crime on that level. And now, of course, when some of the most difficult things that you did is working with the DCFS and taking some of those children out of those homes. And, you know, that for me was the biggest darkness, and seeing
Right.
children in those horrific situations. But it motivated me to do whatever it took to use my talents and my resources to bring about good.
Right.
And here both of us are on the other side of that darkness.
Yeah.
I'm not doing Undercover anymore. Neither are you. You're out. You're speaking. You're sharing.
Right.
And I tell people with the Sound of Freedom movie, we couldn't take millions of people undercover to see what we had seen.
Of course.
But we could help millions of people feel what we had felt.
Right.
And in doing so, help them go through that same transformation in their life that I was able to, and what you're able to, et cetera.
Right.
And so yes, this podcast takes people into the darkness, feeling and hearing some of these dark things. At the same time, the takeaway from it is that we can all heal. We don't have to go that
Right.
dark route. I learned a lot from watching the movie The Joker. You
Yeah.
actually feel all this compassion for this horrific life that he lived, but at the same time, it was his choice to decide to go
Right.
down the dark road.
Right.
There are other people who have had just as much darkness in their life that turn out to be protectors.
Right.
Right? And I honor you.
Thank you.
I respect you for being that protector, for making those choices in your life. We had an undercover operation in Dominican Republic. The mother of 2 children, about the ages of your children right now, was selling her children, not just for an hour, for good. She was selling them for $10,000. She thought that we were taking them to Miami to work in an underage brothel thing. And her words to me, when I was on the phone with her, when she said, okay, I need you to make me one promise. And I thought that this was a compassionate mother was going to say, hey, make me this promise. You're going to take care of my kids and make sure that they're fed well and whatever. She said this. She said, make me this one promise. When you're done with them, I need you to be done with them. She said, I don't want this ever to come back on me. Do you understand my words? She was telling me that they needed to be dead if we weren't prostituting them anymore. And it made me ask myself, okay, what kind of pain was she dealing with? What kind of bad decisions that she made that got her to the point where her 2 beautiful children, her kids were 9 and 11-year-old daughters, where she was selling them to make money and making sure it never came back on her. And it made me incredibly grateful for people like you, and people like my operators who have been through that similar trauma, but made dramatically different choices in their life to bring about good, to create that protective field around children. And that's really what we need to do with humanity as a whole. Just fighting fire with fire, just doing the interrogations, just taking out the cartel guys, just arresting the child traffickers is never going to fix the problem.
Never.
Somehow we need to help humanity heal from that childhood trauma, from all those things that people are holding on to.
Right.
So we're about done. Where can people find you and give us some last words?
So book is on Amazon, Through These Brown Eyes. It's on Audible as well. And then my website, angelicaroblesofficial.com. I'm on all social media platforms. I'm pretty easy to find. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing your story
Thank you.
with us today. I'm super grateful. Thank you for joining us on the Liberating Humanity podcast. This has been a fascinating story, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity to share this with you. Hopefully you can take this story, apply it in your life, find some things that you can do to help bring a positive outcome to your trauma. Look us up on liberatinghumanity.com. Join us on some of our retreats, whatever you need to do to release those things that don't serve you anymore, so that you can be the best husband, the best father, the best wife, the best mother you can possibly be. Thank you for joining us today.